All right, let's jump right in. We're going to be talking about arterial hemodynamics. I know, it sounds super complicated, but really, it's just the physics of how blood moves through your body. And trust me, it's part biology, sure, but it's also some seriously impressive engineering. So what's with this number, 35 million? That's how many times a pressure pulse travels through your arterial system every single year. It's an absolute marvel of natural engineering, working with clockwork precision.
To really wrap our heads around this, we're going to use one big idea for this whole explainer. Think of your circulatory system as a massive, intricate, and unbelievably advanced superhighway.
Okay, so any good superhighway needs a map, right? For our purposes, the most important landmark on that map, the main thing we need to pay attention to, is pressure. It tells us exactly where we are on the journey, from the heart out to the rest of the body. Now check this out. The pressure stays really high on the main highways, the aorta and the big arteries. But then, look what happens at the arterioles. The pressure just takes a nosedive. It absolutely plummets. And this is so important. These tiny little vessels act like the system's traffic controllers. They're the off-ramps, the toll booths, creating resistance to perfectly manage where all that blood needs to go. So to really get how that traffic control works, we've got to zoom in. We need to understand the actual rules of the road, the fundamental physics that govern this entire journey. And the biggest rule of all is resistance. You can think of it as the friction, the opposition that the blood faces as it moves. And like we just saw, those arterioles are the main source of this resistance, which gives your body this incredible pinpoint control over where blood gets sent.
So how does the body actually control this resistance? Well, it all comes down to this really elegant bit of physics called Poiseuille's law. It's basically the master equation, the rulebook that tells us exactly which factors matter the most.
And this is where it gets really interesting. Look at the two columns here. On one hand, you have vessel length. It has an impact, sure, but it's linear. You double the length, you double the resistance. Simple. But the vessel radius, whoa, that is the real game changer. It's not linear at all. Resistance changes to the power of 4. What that means is that a teeny tiny change in the diameter of an artery has a massive, almost exponential effect on blood flow.
And this quote just nails the point perfectly. A tiny 10% narrowing of a blood vessel, which by the way happens all the time in our bodies, cranks up the resistance by more than 50%. That is the power of 4 in action. It's how our body can make these huge, sweeping adjustments with incredibly subtle changes.
So all this pressure has to go somewhere, right? It doesn't just push blood forward. It puts some incredible forces on the walls of the highway itself. And it does this in two totally different but equally critical ways. First up, we have wall shear stress. The easiest way to think about this is to imagine water rushing through a garden hose. You can feel that friction, that sort of dragging force on the inside surface. That's shear stress. It acts sideways along the length of the artery. The second force is called hoop stress. Now this is the outward push. Think about the air inside a car tire. It's constantly pushing out, trying to stretch the rubber. That's hoop stress. It's acting around the circumference of the artery, basically trying to pull it apart. So you've got these two forces, the sideways drag and the outward push. Their directions are totally different, but just look at the numbers. Look at the difference in their typical magnitude. It's not even in the same ballpark. Hoop stress is more than 1,000 times larger than wall shear stress. Just let that sink in for a second. The force trying to stretch our arteries open is monumentally, astronomically greater than the frictional drag of the blood flowing through them. This just shows you the immense, constant structural challenge our artery walls are built to handle, 24/7.
So, how in the world does this incredible superhighway put up with decades of this kind of punishment? Let's take a look at how the system changes and sometimes breaks down as we get older.
And the key idea here is something called arterial stiffness. See, a young, healthy artery is nice and flexible. It's full of a protein called elastin. But over time, that elastin can get replaced by collagen, which is a lot tougher and more rigid. And that, quite simply, makes the artery wall stiffer. So what, right? What happens when the road surface goes from being like flexible asphalt to rigid concrete? How does a stiffer highway actually affect those pressure waves, the traffic that are constantly moving through our body? This table shows something pretty wild. In a 24-year-old, the pulse pressure, that's the difference between the high and low pressure points, it actually gets bigger as it moves away from the heart. It's a healthy thing called amplification.
But now look at the 68-year-old. That amplification is just gone. The pressure is high everywhere. So what's going on?
It all comes down to wave reflection. Okay, so every time your heart beats, it sends a pressure wave down the highway. When that wave hits the smaller vessels way out in the periphery, part of it bounces back, like an echo. In a young, flexible system, that reflected wave is pretty slow. It gets back to the heart while the heart is resting, and this is actually helpful. But, and this is a huge but, in a stiff artery, that reflected wave travels much, much faster. It basically races back and crashes head-on into the next wave just leaving the heart. This collision creates a dangerous pressure spike, which puts a huge strain on the heart. It's like a harmful traffic pileup happening with every single beat. So how does the body even begin to cope with this? And what happens when the body's own coping mechanisms actually start to make the problem even worse?
Well, it can lead to this really nasty, vicious cycle. You start with increased blood pressure. That increases that massive hoop stress we talked about, so the artery walls respond by getting thicker and stiffer to protect themselves. But that very stiffness makes those reflected waves travel even faster, which, as we just saw, jacks up the blood pressure even more. It's a dangerous feedback loop that just keeps feeding itself.
But here's where we get to the hopeful part. We are not flying blind anymore. We can now use things like CT or MRI scans to build these amazing computational models that simulate these forces with incredible detail. We can literally create a digital twin of a person's arteries and watch the blood flow inside.
And that really brings us to the final big question. This superhighway inside of us isn't a black box anymore. As we get better and better at mapping this inner world with this kind of precision, could we one day predict the traffic jams, the blockages, the system failures before they ever have a chance to happen?